which is now pretty much dead, but it dominated the last 10 years in various ways of official and mainstream economic thinking about how you handle the financial crisis. One idea that came forward then is called expansionary fiscal austerity. And that was put forward by a lot of conventional economists as a way of ending the economic crisis that began in 2008. And the argument was that if you have a reduction in government spending, which they were arguing for, they claimed that would actually have the reverse causation of what we were talking about a moment ago. They said if you cut government spending, there'd be a more than offsetting increase in private spending. So their argument was you could cut the government spending levels and actually increase private spending and therefore make the economy grow faster. And this is why I raised the idea of reading that. Who's read that to you, the article for Barrow that I gave you to read for the tutorial? Had a look at it? Somebody? Okay. His argument was that budget deficits don't change total spending. He argued pretty much that if you increase government spending, there'll be a reduction in private spending. So one cancels out the other. That's the idea called Ricardian equivalence. So we'll talk about it in the tutorial today. Now, I think there's frankly delusional thinking going on in that paper. I'm not going to be held back in saying why I think it's delusional, because one of his main arguments to say that to counter people's arguments against his idea was that if people get a government deficit today, they'll save for the future, even if they're not going to be alive when they think the future taxes are going to be levied, because they're doing it so that they can pay their children or their great-grandchildren bequests so that they can pay their future rate of tax. So this sort of idea about households capitalising the entire array of future taxes and thereby planning with an infinite horizon. Okay? I think that's just crazy. But that's the type of logic that was the foundation here to say that an increase in government spending will be countered by a fall in private. So an attempt to stimulate the economy through government spending will fail because that will just mean the private sector spends less, government spending takes its place, but there's no increase in demand coming out of it. A guy called Alessino, who was popular for quite a while, he's not quite so popular now, went even further, and he said that he was actually trying to reduce government debt to GDP, and he argued that a surplus actually stimulates the economy. So rather than one counteracting the other, he said that a government running a surplus will stimulate the economy. Now, that's the opposite of the Keynesian argument that was dominant back in the 50s to the 70s, that government spending stimulated the economy. So his logic was very similar to Barrow's. He had what he called a representative Asian model of the economy. Have you seen that term before? You haven't actually done this in macro yet, I think, but you will at some point. And he said, this is the argument, taking some quotes out of it. We consider a closed economy, so no international trade, with atomistic individuals who can be consumers, workers and voters. That's okay. He said, now, this is the intriguing bit. They are all born at the beginning of period zero and have the same time horizon. This mouse drives me crazy sometimes. Pardon me, I don't know why. I've got to get myself a new mouse. Okay, where did I get to? I'll buy one of those clickers, I think. Okay, here we go. So, that's what I was trying to get to. Righto. Seeing it now? Good. Okay. So you said of a closed economy, that's not a bad abstraction, it's a typical abstraction for economists to start with. This idea about being born at the beginning of period zero, he's trying to bring some sort of argument involving time here. So he's dividing time into two little bits. And he then hits you with a piece of mathematics that when you first see it looks extremely scary. Okay? And this is one reason I got you to look at Barrow, which is not a particularly mathematical paper, but often this stuff looks intimidating when you first see it. But you can break it down, rather than being scared by it, break it down a bit. And what he says here is that this bit here is supposedly the utility that a consumer gets from consumption. That is the utility from leisure. So you've got two ways you can enjoy yourself. One is you consume, the other you relax. Over here, that is the utility from public goods. So you get utility from roads, schools, publicly provided goods as well. And this one over here is the utility from negative utility from warfare. And these are just weighting the two. How much you care. If you're a Labor voter, you care about getting public goods. If you're a Tory voter, you couldn't care about public goods. You simply want the government to be there for warfare, to defend the borders and stuff like that. So it looks incredibly complicated. It falls down to a very simplistic argument. It really does. Just don't let that sort of stuff intimidate you. Just work through what the actual argument is. Now, what he says here is that deficits are a product of politics, because he said if you had a benevolent dictator, then the social planner would adopt as his or her target the average of all the preferences of all the citizens. So you'd get the average of what Tory voters want, what Labor voters want, out of a benevolent dictator. But because you have a alternating Democrats and Republicans, and we're now seeing this fairly dramatically in America, I must admit, then they'll disagree over what's the best division of those goods. So the Democrats will allegedly go for welfare spending, the Republicans will go for warfare. Okay? And you then, because you split into two different camps, you've got two voting blocks arguing what the division should be and whether you should have a surplus or not. And he then said because governments aren't sure they're going to be reappointed, they don't mind about leaving some debt, government debt, for their successors to mop up. So democracy, he argues, was the problem. In a democracy, citizens disagree about whether they should have higher deficits or lower deficits. It'd be better if you had a social planner. And this is a common notion that turns up in mainstream economics these days. So it's a toy model, and this is, again, I'm going to take you through a bit of looking at what Barrow was assuming in Barrow's paper, arguing for what he called Ricardian equivalence. And it doesn't include obvious features of the real world. There are no banks, there's no private debt, and there's no money in the model. Okay? There's no active consideration of any of those. And there's no, when you again take a look at it in detail, there's no sensible analysis of production or time. For example, he says each consumer is endowed with 1 unit of time to be shared between labour and leisure. That's not so bad. But he then says labour can be transformed into a non-storable output, 1 for 1. So you can either have labour for work now, consumption now, or you can store it up for investment. And the government can transform what's produced by the private sector into 2 non-storable public goods. Now, if your head starts to spin when you read this stuff, it's not your fault. Okay. The argument itself is trying to frame your thinking in a very, very strange way. So what he's saying here is that if you're going to have increased government spending, you necessarily have to have less private sector. If there's a 1-for-1 conversion between the two, if the government does something, it's got to take something from private consumption and make it into public. In other words, there's a straight trade-off. Any increased government means a fall in private. Okay. That's what he's framing there. And if you start falling for the logic, I'll show you how you might do this with Barrow's paper later, then you end up assuming a few points, not even where you're assuming. For that to be true, there have to be no idle resources. Okay. Are there no idle resources? Okay. At various times, there's large proportions of the population that aren't fully employed. So he's actually setting you up to think that way without you necessarily being aware that you are. He then says the government can only issue fixed interest debt with 1 period maturity, which means the government has to borrow to finance itself. So the idea is government has a budget constraint. If the government's going to spend money, it has to borrow it from you. It doesn't have any way of creating money itself. And it borrows in this model, because there is actually no money. The only thing that the government can borrow is the consumption good the private sector would otherwise have consumed. Now, believe it or not, this paper became highly influential in political circles. Not because of the logic, I think, but because of the conclusion it reached, that it was good to run surpluses. So he argued that if you have a government debt, you necessarily reduce government services, because you've got to tax to pay the difference. And if you have a fall in government spending, you necessarily get a rise in private spending. So the private sector, if the government spending falls, then the private sector increases both leisure and output. So the whole thing is setting up a strong antagonism between what the government does and what the private sector does. And it's much the same as the Ricardian equivalence argument, but adds additional beliefs that because politics is there and you're swapping between Republican and Democrat, and one party knows if it loses election, the other party has to wear the consequences. What he's saying is rather than getting some equilibrium level of the government debt, you actually get government debt that's too high because each party's happy to leave debt for the other. Okay, so they're not trying to breach the responsible level of debt. So he says the good policy, therefore, is to reduce government spending, government debt. And his theory depends upon the assumptions. The assumptions include a fully employed economy, no money and no private debt, and that public spending necessarily crowds out private. Okay. Do you think Donald Trump believes that government spending will crowd out private? It's hard to work out what he believes, but clearly I think that one he doesn't, because he wants to put a huge infrastructure program in there. And he clearly believes that government spending will stimulate the private sector. That's the other alternative perspective. So what you find happening quite frequently in politics is that a lot of politicians will themselves be inclined towards believing in sound finance. It's widespread through not just the Tories, but also through the Labor Party here. And in America, it's widespread through both Republicans and Democrats as well. So what they think is they'll hear about an academic paper, they'll read a newspaper summary of the paper, and the newspaper will gloss over the way in which the academic reached his argument, and they then think it supports their basic idea of sound finance, saying the government should run a surplus. Now, Alessina followed up by doing some statistics of what happened when government cutbacks occurred, and of course, in doing the stats to analyse his argument, he left out what his own argument didn't include. He didn't include private debt, and he didn't include money itself. And he just looked at what happens when you have a change of government spending and GDP growth, and he said that cutting government spending stimulates the economy. Now, remember that Swedish stuff I showed you at the beginning? You had a period of the government debt falling. At the same time, there was a huge increase in government private debt. Now, maybe the private debt stimulated the economy while the government was cutting. Because he left that particular causal element out, all he saw was when the government spending fell, the economy boomed. Okay, so there's the problem of leaving out the causal argument, not having a complete argument. So he's saying here they're arguing for increased spending, as that'll speed up the recovery. He says the argument might be exactly backward. History shows that cutting spending in order to reduce deficits may be the key to promoting economic recovery. Now, that summary is what politicians saw. They didn't see the logic lying behind it, and they didn't see that the argument might be complete. So, writing back during the crisis, he's saying that the risk of renewed recession might come not from the spending cuts, but from the sovereign debt overhang. So, a large part of the pressure that the euro imposed upon Spain and Portugal, and Greece and Italy and France and so on to cut their government spending was supported by this proposition that cutting government spending would stimulate the economy. Now, when you look at, he's in looking at America, he said that the stimulating effect from a government surplus, government deficit, is quite small. So saying if you spend an extra $1 of government money, you might get 50 cents more GDP out of it. Okay, that's the type of proposition he's putting across there. So he said, what then happens is, if you're going to stimulate, and this is again an argument you'll find that it's in Barrow as well, the argument that, I think my mouse has died now, pardon me, stimulus spending means tax increases must come in the future. So again, this idea that a budget deficit now means you have to have a surplus in the future, extra taxes. So, and again, he's making a proposition, a political proposition in this sense, that large cuts in government spending lead to expansions, not recessions. So how can they be expansionary? Well, he says if you have tax increase now, that's telling you you won't have taxes in the future. So you don't need to save money to pay future taxes. And therefore people are willing to spend if they think taxes are going to be limited in the future. Okay, that's the type of logic lying behind this argument. And he then champions Europe and says, well, Europe seems to have learnt this, but fiscal policy in America hasn't. So effectively, before we actually saw the history of the last 8 years or so, he's saying that Europe has learnt the lesson. It will therefore cut government spending, and therefore the private sector will spend more and the economy will grow. Whereas the Americans are being irresponsible and running deficits, and therefore the private sector will save money and the economy won't grow. That's the argument made about 8 years ago. So what he's got, if we're now looking back on history, this argument's been shot out of the water because Europe did fiscal consolidation. They tried to cut government spending. Unemployment in Europe is running twice as high as America, where they ran deficits. So the empirical argument has been fairly strongly slaughtered. But he appeared to get a good argument out of what is clearly a bad theatre. Well, what he's doing, for a start, is ignoring the private sector. He's ignoring the private sector can borrow money to finance its spending. And he's only considering a change in government spending and the level of economic activity. And he's saying there's a causal chain from government spending to economic activity. So the government cuts spending now, there'll be more economic activity in the future. Well, this is now looking at the American situation. And you find an extremely strong correlation between change in government debt and level of unemployment. So that's what you're looking for. If that's what your model tells you to focus upon, you find this very strong correlation and say, well, obviously, when there's a government deficit, there's therefore high unemployment. So maybe if we don't have a government deficit, we'll have lower unemployment. That's right. What I've done here is I've turned things upside down, by the way, to make... this is actually the normal way around. So 0% unemployment down here, 12% up there. That's the blue line. The red line's change in government debt. They track each other very closely. And of course, what's the causal sequence? He's arguing government spending, increased government spending means people don't spend as much, therefore there's more unemployment. That's his causal argument. But the one that he's ignoring is what I've been talking about in this lecture, and that is the role of private debt. When you look at change in private debt, you find that there's a stronger correlation still between change in private debt and unemployment in the opposite direction. So if private debt is falling, let's take it's stronger again from 1990 on. If debt change is falling, so the rate of change of private debt falls, unemployment rises. If the rate of change of private debt gets higher, unemployment falls. And you get this later stage here. You can see just how strongly negative the correlation is. Rising private debt means falling unemployment. Falling change in private debt means rising unemployment. Now this particular piece of data was left out of Alessina's logic and left out of Barrow's logic completely, and I want to take you through why they matter a lot more than Alessina and Barrow realised when they're arguing for fiscal austerity, because the alternative explanation comes from Minsky, and that is that a high change in private debt, when you've got a high level of debt as well, means that that expansion in debt is a major source of spending. So if you have a rising level of private debt, that's going to increase demand and income, and that'll drive unemployment down. The falling unemployment, and this is where the reverse correlation comes in, means that taxes rise and spending falls. So the increased economic activity is what drives the government into a surplus. So the government gets a surplus, and the falling private debt, then you get the other side. When debt goes the opposite direction, you get falling private debt, demand declines, income declines, and unemployment goes up, and therefore taxes fall and spending rise. So the government goes into a deficit. So you've got to have the three factors there. You've got to look at the level of economic activity, what the government's doing in terms of its borrowing, and what the private sector is doing as well. So Minsky's got an explanation that ties the three factors together Alesina and Barrow are completely ignoring private credit, so they leave out one of the three major factors from Minsky's point of view. So Minsky wasn't listened to. But what happened was that the neoclassicals accepted this argument that you should cut government spending to stimulate the economy, and then the financial crisis hit. Watching my time here. Okay. And initially they accepted, they went into panic mode first of all and spent like crazy. Then when the economy seemed to survive that, you're now in the aftermath of the crisis, and they headed back towards the idea that cutting government spending could actually stimulate the economy. So my favourite example here is Olivier Blanchard, who was chief economist of the IMF in 2010, and he accepted a lot of this mainstream stuff and was defending it after the financial crisis. And as part of his defence, he said that you shouldn't throw out what would be just because we didn't get the financial crisis right doesn't mean you should reject economic theory. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, so he says. Then he said a whole range of, even after the crisis, a whole lot of mainstream thought still must hold. So he said, for example, we have to aim for stability in output and inflation. The natural rate that the economy reaches, the natural rate of unemployment, that still holds. You shouldn't believe there's a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. Stable inflation is a major goal, but the point I want to get to down here is he's arguing in favour of fiscal sustainability. Okay? Even after the crisis, he's still saying what you have to try to do is to get that government deficit down, and that's the main focus they had. Now, what actually occurred, and I'll give him credit here, in analysing the data, looking back, what he found was that cutting government spending had a far more drastic impact on reducing demand than he thought it did. He said that stronger fiscal consolidation, so cutting the budget deficit, had a lower growth rate than they thought it would. So rather than cutting government spending, boosting the economy, or at least having a small negative impact, they found it had a large negative impact. And he tried to rationalise this. Remember I mentioned fiscal multipliers earlier when talking about Alesina's ideas. He was saying that the fiscal multipliers are quite small. So if you increase government spending by $1, you might only get 30 cents additional spending. What Blanchard found here was that for every dollar cut out of government spending, aggregate private spending fell by $1.70. So there's a very large negative impact on the economy by cutting government spending during a crisis. And in fact, it says fiscal multipliers, fluctuate from near zero in normal times. That's the argument that Barrow and Alesina both had, that changing government spending had no impact upon the economy because an increase in government spending meant a fall in private spending. Here he's saying it looks like it's 2.5. So if you cut government spending during a recession, you're going to get 2.5 times as much of a fall in private spending. So rather than stimulating, it was a major negative for the economy. So you're saying a 1% cut during a recession, and if you're trying to cut government spending by 1% to get the government debt to GDP ratio down, you can cut GDP by 2.5%. So then you've got your numerator and your denominator. You're trying to reduce government spending by reducing the numerator. What happens is the denominator falls 2.5 times as fast. So your ratio can actually get worse. In that case, therefore, if you actually cut spending, you can end up increasing your debt to GDP ratio. All right, let's take a bit of a break there and come back in about 5 or 10 minutes and keep on going. So this is the empirical result that Blanchard actually got, that he advocated cutting government spending, consolidation to get ready for the next crisis, and in fact found for every 1% cut in government spending, GDP fell by 2.5%. So he rejected the idea of expansionary fiscal consolidation after that experience. And when you look at it empirically, this was one of the charts in the paper, he had a look at just what the forecasts of fiscal consolidation was going to be against how much the growth estimates were wrong, just what would happen. So the biggest contraction was Greece, which cut its spending by 5.5%. Now, the argument was this is going to stimulate the economy. In fact, what happened was, by having that 5% cut in spending, growth ended up being 7% lower than they thought it would be. Okay? So their estimate of where you get to is wrong by 7% in terms of the annual rate of growth. It's huge. That means like rather than +3, it was -4. That's quite a large change. On the other hand, Germany actually had a 2.5% increase in spending. Now, according to the analysis that Blanchard did at the time, that would have meant a fairly dramatic decline in spending in GDP. In fact, growth was 4% higher than predicted. So when you look at that difference, they had a huge error in saying that cutting spending was going to be positive. The countries that cut spending had a huge negative. The countries that increased spending had a huge positive. So his arguments are quite wrongly cited. I'll leave that one on the chart. This is one reason Blanchard changed his mind. The argument was that fiscal consolidation would stimulate the economy, and they had all these predictions from the models that argued for it about the impact of cutting government spending on GDP. So Greece was forced to contract its spending by 5.5% of GDP. That meant that the growth level that they got ended up being 7% lower than they thought it would be. And particularly for Germany, 2.5% increase in spending. According to their model, it should have had a bad impact. In fact, they got a 4% higher rate of growth than their models predicted. So this led Blanchard to being willing to give up his theory and say that maybe we shouldn't have tried fiscal consolidation. And then if you look at the contrast that Alessina was drawing between the Americans who weren't being fiscally responsible and the Europeans who were, and how the Europeans had it right and the Americans didn't, when you take a look at the level of Greek debt to GDP, remember they've been trying to cut Greek debt. In fact, it rose quite substantially after the crisis. You had, when fiscal consolidation got really imposed heavily, the debt ratio rose. On the other hand, the Americans had a lower level of debt to begin with, admittedly, found that who didn't, and they weren't trying. There was various political arguments in Congress to try to. Pardon me, I've got a phone call coming from one of my PhD students. Hang on, no, it's good. No, it's not. But I've got to say no. Hang on a second. Pardon me. I had to leave it on because I've got a PhD student saying I have to get a document shortly. So. Okay, I've got to leave it up for Tim to turn up. So the attempt to control the budget deficit and reduce government spending which was imposed on Greece led to an increase on the debt ratio, ignoring, not because they wanted to, but the Americans, did you see the discussions in America had what they called a fiscal cliff? Okay. They were trying to, because the Americans could never manage to get a policy through Congress, what the Republicans did was work in reverse and say, well, let's block anything changing and let that hit the government. So they blocked government spending and said they were going to make an agreement that stopped government spending at a particular date. And that was called the fiscal cliff because at that point, government revenue they were going to be unable to spend. They failed to get that effectively done. So the government just basically went on with its previous momentum, which meant that the government had a large deficit, as I showed you in that early chart, hitting 10% of GDP. The attempts to stop that being increased didn't work, so you basically had a large government deficit. But what actually happened to the debt level, it flatlined ultimately after it rose for a while during the crisis, it flatlined later. The Greeks who were forced to try to cut their deficits actually saw their debt ratio rise. So it's the whole thing about looking just at the level of government spending, which is the numerator, not considering the impact it's going to have on the GDP, which is the denominator. Cutting that numerator can actually lead to the denominator falling more. So the 1% cut for government spending, 2.5% fall for GDP, you get an increase in the debt ratio, even though you're trying to reduce the debt ratio. And I'll show you a little model about that shortly as well. So with the Americans, even though they had a rising level of debt, of government debt, their ratio remained constant. This is looking at the percentage of debt, change in government debt per year. And the blue line is the Americans. The red line is the Greeks. Now, the Greeks had a huge deficit when the crisis first hit. But then, in the aftermath, a huge increase in the ratio. The Americans had a increase in government debt for a while, but it then went down to very low levels and has since been falling. So the Americans did not focus on fiscal consolidation and ended up stabilising their debt to GDP ratio. The Greeks were forced to try by the European Union to cut government spending, and the debt ratio rose. So lots of paradoxical outputs for those who believe that fiscal consolidation is a good idea. And if you look at the unemployment rates, the top line is, I've chosen Spain rather than Greece because people always criticise Greece for all sorts of things they did wrong in terms of bad tax policies and rules that, excessive pensions, etc., and also having a huge level of government debt before the crisis. You can't criticise Spain that way. It did everything right according to the mainstream. But Spain ends up with an unemployment rate of 25%, whereas America is down towards the 5% rate right now. So Europe, which had fiscal austerity imposed upon it by the European Union, has done very badly. America, which sort of shared the same philosophy but couldn't actually implement it, and basically went with effectively what we might call automatic stabilisers, came out of it fairly okay. So empirically, it's a fairly strong argument against the proposition that Barrow made that fiscal consolidation is a good idea. So what you had was attempts to do what are called sound finance by politicians actually had unsound results. The debt ratio rose when the government cut spending to try to reduce the ratio. So there are feedbacks. In other words, the government is not taking into account. So the recovery was inversely related to how sound the budget was. The more sound the budget was for a country, the worse its recovery. Okay? So rather than sound finance is supposed to be sound because it's supposed to improve your economic situation. Okay? That's the overall vision. And it's coming back to an analogy of seeing the family, seeing like a household. If a household lets its budget go out of control, it'll go bankrupt. And the same sort of thinking for a government. Government get a budget out of control, it'll go bankrupt. But in fact, they find when they worry about it and try to cut government spending, the economy suffers very badly. So there's got to be something wrong with the underlying arguments. And what they're doing, and all the way through, they're ignoring money, where they talk about the government deficit measured in monetary terms, but the actual model, as I've shown you, Alessina's model and Barrow's model, they don't have money in them. They don't ask the question, where does money come from? And they ignore private debt as well. So there's an alternative approach which is strictly monetary, saying let's actually look at the economy in terms of monetary flows now and see what happens, and ask what does a government surplus mean in the flows of money between the government sector and the private sector? Well, the surplus means government taxes are greater than government spending in money terms. Okay? If you think about the government taxing you as the private sector and spending on you as the private sector as well, then if there's going to be a surplus, the government is going to be taking more money out of private bank accounts than it pays back into them. So one impact of a government trying to run a surplus is it going to cause if nothing else happens, just looking at that alone, private bank accounts are going to tend to fall.